Okay, good morning everybody. Now we have the second Agora lecture, who will be architect Juhani Pallasmaa. He has been architect since 1960s and he established the Pallasmaa Architects in 1983. And he has also taught at the Helsinki University of Technology. And he has also had various visiting professorships internationally. And he has published widely, and his theme today will be aesthetic experience as spiritual experience, and especially in the context of architecture. So please welcome Juhani Pallasmaa.
Good morning. I need to use my notes because I've been working on 2 books on completely other subject matters, so my thoughts are not quite focused on this subject matter. I'm going to give a lecture that I prepared in principle for the Catholic University of America, where I held a visiting professorship a year ago. There was also a conference on sacredness, and and I have entitled it now "The Sacred in Architecture, Art and Existential Sacredness." The origin of architecture is usually seen in terms of providing physical shelter from the elements and threats. However, the primary task of architecture is to create the experience of placeness, that is, to define man's location and domicile in relation to the homogeneous, placeless, and meaningless natural space that extends to infinity. The experience of placeness implies the perception of the place as a distinct gestalt that can be named and a specific meaning that can be projected on it. Places structure our experiences of the world as well as our understanding of ourselves. We cannot exist mentally in a non-place. I am the space where I am, the French poet Noël Arnaud argues. Architecture structures and domesticates both space and time to be lived and inhabited by us. As Carsten Harris, the philosopher, argues, architecture is not only about domesticating space, it is also a deep defense against the terror of time. The language of beauty is essentially the language of timeless reality. I'm very impressed by this notion, the terror of time. It has become a meaningful, very meaningful notion for me. Places, cities, and buildings also structure our experiences of time as they give the measureless and endless natural time a human scale and make the continuum of time conceivable to the human mind. The temporal layering of man-made structures has a significant mental task. With the layered historicity of the human habitat materializes and concretizes the passage of time and life. Buildings are simultaneously instrumental devices and artistic expressions, objects of utility and metaphysical contemplation. Architectural structures also concretize hierarchies and mark the worlds of divinities and mortals. Rudolf Wittkower describes the metaphysical intention of Renaissance architecture as follows, quote, "The belief in the correspondence of macrocosm and microcosm, in the harmonic structure of the universe, in the comprehension of God through the mathematical symbols of center, circle, and sphere. All these closely related ideas, which had their roots in antiquity and belong to the undisputed tenets of medieval philosophy and theology, acquired new life in the Renaissance," unquote. Yet, the essence of architectural expression is the human existential condition, as in all art forms. The experience of architectural sacredness is generated equally by the image of the Greek temple in the landscape as the worldly metaphor of cosmic order, the dramatic sense of material and gravity, light and shadow of a vaulted Romanesque space, the rising of the gaze into the heights of a Gothic cathedral, the illusory space of movement evoked by the structures, sculptures, and paintings in a Baroque church, and the opening of the interior of an ascetic modern chapel to the landscape, making us experience our connectedness with nature and cosmos. These are all familiar images of sacred architecture or sacredness in architecture. But a sacred experience may also be evoked by worldly settings without any specific intention for sacredness. The experience of sacredness evoked by a work of art or architecture is essentially a different category of experience than religious sacredness. The latter is associated with specific places, events, phenomena, or objects such as Holy Land, Holy Grave, Holy Supper, Holy Spirit, Holy Trinity, Holy Sacraments, etc., which have been denominated as sacred in the Holy Word, or which have been otherwise sanctified by a religious order. Religious sacredness thus implies the encounter of an object which has been specifically named or designated sacred. On the contrary, the sacredness invoked by an artistic or architectural work is a personal and individual existential experience which obtains its impact and aura, to use Walter Benjamin's notion, without specific religious symbolization or connotation, through the inherent nature of human experience. Such an experience may arise, for example, from an exceptional sense of place or space, purity of form, intense materiality or color, or a transcendental illumination. The symbolic representation of mythical and sacred events has historically been among the central themes of artistic works, but even in these explicit representations of religious events, the actual experience of sacredness arises from artistic qualities and associations, irrespective of any deliberate religious symbolizations. An artistic and architectural experience of sacredness, detached from explicit devotional purposes, seems to arise from a nameless and unintentional origin, which is initiated by a sensitized encounter of self and the world. It arises from the holiness of life itself and deep existential experiences of being. Beauty evokes images of a utopian and spiritualized reality. The pure shapes of Constantin Brancusi's sculptures do not possess an explicit religious content, but irrespective of the actual subject matter, a human figure, fish, bird, or a primordial egg shape, for instance, their radiant beauty makes them appear as harbingers of otherness, a more perfect and timeless world. Similarly, the contemporary pollen, honey, and milk works of Wolfgang Leib exude an air of holiness through their existential purity and association with the origin of life. They also appear as images of the originary human innocence. In the art form of architecture, even buildings constructed for earthly purposes can project experiences of sacredness in the same way that an extraordinarily beautiful painting, devoid of deliberate religious subject matter, can evoke the air of sacredness through the absolute purity of its intention. The marble courtyard of Louis Kahn's Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, seen against the horizon line of the Pacific Ocean, turns the entire sky into a celestial ceiling of this ascetic outdoor space, and this authoritative space silences the visitor to cosmic reflection. This is one of the spaces that has completely silenced me. Even when I look at photographs later of this space, they bring an absolute silence in my mind. Luis Barragan's minute structures in Mexico for domestic and other mundane purposes, such as horse stables and drinking troughs, similarly create a dreamlike microcosm, images of metaphysical transcendence and paradise. In Alvarado's view, profound architecture always aspires to the image of paradise. This is what he wrote as a young man. Architecture has an ulterior motive, the idea of creating paradise. That is the only purpose of our buildings. We wish to build a paradise on earth for man. Sacredness can also be encountered in aesthetically unself-conscious and unassuming vernacular settings and objects, as in Walter Evans' famous photograph, The Farmer's Kitchen on the left, which for me is one of the most iconic pictures I know. I look at this picture at least every month, and a famous Finnish writer, poet, Bo Karpelan, who was a close friend of mine, also had this as his personal icon. Another image that brings tears to my eyes is a Finnish peasant smoke hut. The black purity of this space is just astonishing. When I stepped to the doorway of the smoke hut at the National Museum, I have tears in my eyes because of the holiness of life that this black interior reflects. Aesthetic purity and utilitarian rationality, sensuality and restraint are fused into a virtuous beauty, resulting in a sense of sacredness, as in Shaker architecture and objects. A sense of holiness. Shaker, there was a Shaker interior earlier, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. A sense of holiness is equally evoked by the pitch black interior of the Finnish peasants' chimneyless smoke hut of olden days, which projects images of serenity and sacredness, of simple and severe life. Shining blackness of soot turns into a symbol of homeness, cleanness, and purity. That's a peculiar metamorphosis. Black soot becomes a symbol of purity. The protective, calming, and focusing essence of home attains here metaphysical qualities. The home turns into a space of devotion and an expression of existential gratitude. The experience of architectural sacredness arises from the specificity and singularity of the space, which surpasses the sphere of everyday normality. This sacredness is not necessarily explicitly intended or symbolized. It arises from existential meanings which we ourselves project onto the space. An exceptional landscape, a solemn urban space, or the mere site of a former house in a forest erased by fire, which has already been taken over by vegetation, evoke impressions and significations beyond the commonplace. If you ever run into a ruin of an old house, or there might only be a few stones in the forest, you stop because you have entered a kind of a church. There is the past life is expressed and celebrated by the remains of the human domicile. These encounters ignite the fire of our imagination. As a place or a space transcends its mere utilitarian purpose, it evokes our sympathy and directs our awareness beyond everyday reality. The extraordinary quality of the mind is the capacity of our imagination to reflect particular meanings on our experiences. These unconscious associations and meanings even guide and direct our perceptions. Contrary to common understanding, perception is not an autonomous and mechanical function of the senses. It is defined and determined by the meanings we unconsciously project on the perceived phenomenon, and the percept merges with imagination. There is no perception without imagination. Natural beauty, particular scenery, or even specific conditions of weather often awaken feelings of serenity and sacredness. Such conditions of nature appear perfect and meaningful, and they evoke the reading of intentionality and consequently the existence of the Creator with his divine purposes. Since the romantic landscape painting of the 19th century, the notion of sublime beauty has implied a view of the world which surpasses human scale and possesses powerful and even terrifying qualities. The enigmatic landscapes of Caspar David Friedrich, as well as of the 19th century American landscape painters, exemplify this sublime dimension in the art of painting. The experience of solemn serenity is similarly expressed in artworks of our own time, such as Barnett Newman's and Mark Rothko's immense canvases. In architectural experience, the category of the sublime is associated with a scale beyond the human measure, or with severe simplicity and geometry. The Egyptian pyramids or the peristyle of the Karnak temple create a sublime and absolute silence through the superhuman scale. 2 years ago I had the chance to visit Louis Khan's parliament building at Dhaka in Bangladesh, and it is the building on the lower image. Is one of the most powerful pieces of architecture I have ever seen. It almost knocked me off my feet. And all I could think of was the Karnak temple in Egypt. And when I got home and I went through some Louis Kahn books, yes, he had been to Karnak before he started to design this building, and the sketch on in the upper image is one of Louis Kahn's sketches of Karnak temple before he designed the parliament in Dhaka, which is one of the true architectural miracles. He was a Jewish man born on Saarenmaa, just 100 kilometers from here, became perhaps the greatest architect of 20th century, and as his last work As a Jew, he designed the capital of an Islamic nation in Dhaka. And when you walk in the streets of Dhaka and talk to anyone, a taxi driver, anyone, they are so proud about the parliament building, which has given them one of the poorest nations on earth, pride and self-identity. That's the miracle of art and architecture. The relentless geometry of Louis Kahn's buildings, as well as the uncompromising aesthetic perfection of Mies van der Rohe's structures, evoke equally sublime beauty, suggesting an air of sacredness. In their very aesthetic absoluteness, these buildings seem to reveal the metaphysical and hidden essence of reality. The artistic meanings of works of art and architecture are not given iconographic significations. They are generated by the viewer's own intentions and experiences. Our very being in the world is fused with an embodied and sensory understanding, through which we understand the meaning of our life situation, as well as of the works of art that we encounter. Essences and facts are incommensurable, and the one who begins with facts will never end up with essences. Understanding is not a quality entering our human reality from outside, it is the natural content of being. This is Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre's poignant statement implies that understanding and meaning are intertwined in our existential experience itself. According to the poetic notion of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, we live in the flesh of the world. I love this expression, the flesh of the world. We are not outsiders and spectators of our world, but an inseparable part of this very universe. The world is constituted through us, and we inhabit the world. Finally, I am my world, as Ludwig Wittgenstein exclaims. Openness to interpretation and a layered richness of association are ingredients of all significant artistic works. They are not symbols. They are existential objects, which place themselves directly in our awareness and experience of being. As Merleau-Ponty states, we do not come to see the work of art, but the world according to it. Instead of mediating symbolization, profound works of art have their impact directly on our existential sense through embodied simulation and empathy. This is what Jean-Paul Sartre writes about this very painting crucifixion by Tintoretto. Quote, Tintoretto did not choose the yellow rift in the sky above Golgotha to signify or evoke anguish. Not an anguish of the sky or the sky of grief. It is a materialized anguish and grief, which has turned into that yellow rift in the sky. It is no more readable. End of quote. This is a powerful argument about the thingness of artistic effects. Artistic works are things. We experience the world and ourselves momentarily as if redirected and rearticulated by the artistic object. The experience is not the encounter of an object outside ourselves, but an intertwining of the object and our consciousness. The experiencing is a kind of an exchange. We project our emotions and intentions to the object, whereas the object lends us its authority, its aura, that entices unique associations and feelings in us. A powerful artistic experience is, before all, an intense encounter with ourselves. Our individual existential experience is momentarily reinforced and amplified through the consciousness of a great artist. This is the meaningful equality of art. I can sense myself through the sensory capacity and intellectual capacity of the greatest minds of mankind. I can sense myself through Michelangelo or Leonardo, if I look at their works that way. In his book, Water and Dreams, the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard makes a distinction between images of form and images of matter, and suggests that the latter are capable of evoking deeper emotional responses than the former. Early modernity focused on form, whereas materiality has become more central in the artistic expressions of the last decades. In the works of Jānis Kunellis, for instance, everyday materials such as plates of steel, rocks, sacks of burlap, hemp, heaps of coal, and carcasses of animals attain touching poetic impressions. These works exude a sense of enigma and density, and they suggest sacred rites and rituals. The monochromatic and gilded surfaces of Yves Klein's paintings create an air of holiness in the same way as the golden auras of saints in icon paintings. Klein's paintings are in fact icons, devoid of pictorial contents or connections with any specific religious themes. Also, James Turrell's ethereal lightworks possess an iconic presence as they guide the viewer to the very limit of his/her perceptual capacities and experience of being. Does the mysterious light of the work exist physically and objectively, or is one looking at an illusionary projection of one's own nervous system? What does truly and objectively exist? And what is true in one's experiential and existential perspective? The dark light of Mark Rothko's and Ad Reinhardt's paintings leads the viewer to another borderline, which lies beyond intellectual and verbal definitions. As Arthur Zasonk, a physicist, argues in his recent book entitled Catching the Light, the Entwined History of Light and Mind. He argues that we could not see light without our mental inner light. There would not be light out there without an inner light. And this is a physicist's argument, mind you. It is a mental limit beyond which new conditions of being and awareness seem to prevail. What is the ground of existential understanding? Have I reached the borderline of my very existence? I see black light were actually the last words of Victor Hugo. The materiality of architecture and material uniformity evoke experiences of serenity. The Klippan Church outside of Malmö by Sigurd Leverens is an architectural microcosm constructed solely of dark, burnt bricks. This church is an enclosed world, an architectural microcosm built of a single material, and it directs the visitor's awareness and thoughts to the ultimate shore of life. The space projects a mysterious and therapeutic darkness and shadow more than light. The dark crack in the brick floor brings Mother Earth, death, and afterlife into one's consciousness. The visitor is granted a glimpse into the final abyss of time. The experience of nostalgia and sorrow humbles the visitor and integrates him, her, with a healing sense of time. The aesthetic spaces of Arno Ruusuvuori and Pekka Pitkänen in Finland and of Tadao Ando in Japan, cast in concrete, create similar feelings of spiritual focusing through the material uniformity and emptiness, and the ultimate restraint and dialectics of matter, space, and light. There is an extraordinary chapel, there are two extraordinary chapels right here in Turku, the Resurrection Chapel by Erik Brygman, and then just 2 minutes walk from the Pekka Pitkänen's chapel. They are among the finest in the entire world, so the foreigners might spend a good hour and two visiting these two spaces. Silence has an authoritative voice in these ascetic spaces. Even objects are capable of mediating metaphysical and sacred meanings without reference to conventional symbolization. In Walker Evans' famous interior, which we already saw, of a poor southern sharecropper's shack, a tin washing bowl and a white linen towel radiate the nobility and sacredness of humble life. Poverty and suffering project a strangely dignified radiance. Human dignity seems to emerge in scarcity and need and disappear in prosperity and abundance. In the surreal materialism and obsessive consumption of today, the dignity of the human soul is lost. the everyday utilitarian shaker objects, and of the traditional Japanese as well as Finnish peasant cultures, evoke equally moving images of the dignity and holiness of severe life. True beauty arises from limits and reduction rather than from unconstrained and willful choice. The bottles, vessels, and cups on a tabletop in Giorgio Morandi's minute still lifes are indeed impressive witnesses of the power of artistic reduction and compression. Mere household objects suffice to represent the entire universe of human experience. The paintings of Morandi are among the most metaphysical works of art I have ever seen, and it is just astonishing how 2 or 3 objects on a table can become an image of the entire world. In the words of the Russian film director Andrei Tarkovsky, the artistic image is not a specific meaning, but the entire world is reflected in it as in a drop of water. And I repeat here what I already showed you, a sentence by Maurice Merleau-Ponty: "We do not come to see a work of art, but the world according to it." And this is exactly the message of and the power of Morandi still lifes. They are a world, a universe. These images do not depict mere common objects. They represent the metaphysical enigma of human existence. They pose the mysterious question of nature of being, of the nature of being. To be, to exist, is the ultimate verb. And these significant objects share this mysterious and monumental act with us. The air of sacredness in a religious space derives from various experiential properties such as scale, form, materiality, and color. Acoustic qualities, as well as evocations of touch and sense, can also be part of the impression of sacredness that detaches us from the commonplace reality and directs our consciousness towards religious feelings and emotions. Yet, the most subtle and expressive medium in the language of architecture is light. Ultimate human emotions such as grief and joy, melancholy and ecstasy, sorrow and bliss may all be expressed through light, but hardly through any of the material ingredients of architecture. A building is constructed of matter, but the essence of its space is always determined by illumination. Also, the impression of sacredness in a religious space usually arises from the specific character of its illumination. Religious light reveals and heals, mediates and unifies. The contained and articulated light inside the religious building differs from the worldly natural light outside in the same way as existential space differs from physical space. The Church of the Three Crosses by Alvarado, as well as Juha Leiviskä's more recent Nyrmäki Church in Helsinki, are are impressive examples of contemporary religious spaces in which light creates an atmosphere of dignity, integrity, and hope. Light is simultaneously the messenger of life and the transcendent dimension beyond. The spaces of these churches also invoke the calming and comforting light of the Nordic landscape and forest. These spaces guide us back to the nature of all origins. A powerful work of art creates a kind of a short circuit of consciousness by means of weakening our rational capacities of deduction and inviting primordial emotional reactions, primordial emotional understanding, I would say. Literature is born at the boundary between self and the world, and during the creative process, this boundary softens, turns penetrable, and allows the world to flow into the artist and the artist to fuse with the world, writes Salman Rushdie. This fusion of the world and the self, described here by the writer, applies to all our artistic experience. A similar fusion takes place in encounters with architecture, although the mental impact of architecture usually appears as a less dramatic form of unconscious pre-understanding that directs and conditions the act of experience itself. We do not encounter the world or the object of our attention from outside as a separate entity, but we share our very existence with it. And here is where Merleau-Ponty's wonderful idea of the flesh of the world enters. We live in the flesh of the world and we share with our own body this very flesh. Architecture frames and focuses human perceptions and existential experiences and provides them with a distinct horizon of understanding and meaning. When viewed through a window, the landscape is already pre-selected and pre-viewed by the building itself. A natural scene or a condition of weather is experienced differently when framed and interpreted through an architectural device than when confronted immediately in its natural state. My earliest experience of architecture that I can recall was during the war when I lived at my farmer grandfather's farm close to Hämeenlinna. We were out in the forest doing something, and a very heavy rain started, and there was a wooden shelter without walls, but just a roof where my grandfather stored something. And we were under that roof, and the rain was beating that roof. And at the age of 4, I realized this is architecture. It's wonderful. Gaston Barre's a natural scene or a condition of weather is experienced differently when framed and interpreted through an architectural device than when confronted unmediated in its natural state. And that was the essence of my childhood experience. I realized the rain out there, just half a meter from me, is a very different rain than what I'm experiencing under the architectural shelter. Gaston Bachelard actually criticizes Martin Heidegger's view of the inherent human anxiety of being thrown into the world. As he says, The house is the human being's first world before he is cast into the world, as claimed by certain hasty metaphysics. Man is laid in the cradle of the house, a wonderful expression, the cradle of the house. We are all born into that cradle. We are not cast into the world unprotected. From the very beginning of our existence, our relation with the world is unavoidably articulated by an architectural structure. The specific task of ecclesiastic architecture is to create mental conditions for the confrontation of the basic essences of life and faith. The impact of a religious space, or of any architectural space for that matter, which touches our emotions deeply, is born from the bodily, sensory, and mental language of architecture itself. It's not symbolism, it's space itself. Sir Colin St. John Wilson, who was the architect of the British Library, for instance, explains the secret and pre-reflective power of architecture as follows. Quote, "It is as if I am being manipulated by some subliminal code, not to be translated into words, which acts directly on the nervous system and imagination, at the same time steering intimations of meaning with vivid spatial experience as though they were one thing. It is my belief that the code acts so directly and vividly upon us because it is strangely familiar. It is, in fact, the first language we ever learned long before words, and which is now recalled to us through art, which alone holds the key to revive it." Yes. End of quote. Yes, I think this reveals the secret of the language of arts. Art brings us back to pre-conscious, pre-conceptual relations, our relations and experiences of the world. Religious symbols serve to connect the ecclesiastic space with specific theological contexts and ideas. But the true emotional impact arises from architecture's own spatial, material, and sensory language. Architecture implies autonomous metaphysical thinking through images and impressions specific to this art form of construction and its tectonic language, which directly address the body and the mind. As we are even capable of identifying and deeply affected by sacred spaces of alien cultures, the experience of architectural sacredness must transcend boundaries of religious ideologies. As the encounter of architectural sacredness is detached from the connotations and symbolizations of specific religions, it turns into a meta-religious and existential experience. The most moving encounter with the sacred dimension, for me personally, was a visit 35 years ago to the Aboagora Canyon in Mali, south of the Saharan desert, to study the architecture and artifacts of the Dogon culture. I had a feeling that every stone, tree, object, and human act had its divine purpose and origin. I learned only later that the Dogons, in fact, actually repeat phases of their complex cosmogony in each of their daily acts, and thus continue the creation of the world every single day. The left-hand image is a drawing by a famous French anthropologist on the Double Mythical Arc by which the first man landed on Earth. The other object is the daily basket, which has the same shape as the celestial ark. The world is constantly being created. It is always in statu nascendi, in a divine present tense of becoming. Even the smallest aspects of nature and life obtain specific meanings from this collectively understood and uncontestable mythical ground. I knew nothing about their cosmology when I visited there, but I was deeply touched because my body understood the meanings. I read Dogon mythologies only after my visit. I have also encountered silence in sacredness in the raked sand garden of the Ryoanji Zen temple in Kyoto, with its 15 moss-covered stones set on a rectangular sand court as its sole motive. This minimal still life, which is not similar to Giorgio Morandi's still lifes. This minimal still life turns into a hypnotic image of the cosmos and the untouchable authority of the sacred. The imagery shifts from the foaming waves of a primordial ocean to mountain peaks, puncturing the sublime landscape of billowing clouds. The feeling of sacredness in architecture as well as the arts is a category of experience arising from our encounter of a timeless, archetypal, or mythical existence. Our worldly, materialistic, and obsessively rationalistic culture has, however, turned into a depressive and unsatisfactory lifestyle by imprisoning life in a one-dimensional reality. In his seminal book, One-Dimensional Man, Herbert Marcuse argues that the citizens of the industrial societies themselves become one-dimensional as the second reality of human experience disappears. And along with this reduction, the tension between everyday world and the world of ideals is lost. He uses the provocative expression, the radical empiricist onslaught. That's what we are experiencing. In Marcuse's view, our materialist and hedonistic culture aspires to fuse the dimension of ideals into everyday life and thus to create a paradise on earth. This is what Marcuse writes. Today's novel feature is the flattening out of the antagonism between culture and social reality through the obliteration of the oppositional, alien, and transcendent elements in the higher culture, by virtue of which it constituted another dimension of reality. This liquidation of two-dimensional culture takes place not through the denial and rejection of the cultural values, but through their wholesale incorporation into the established order, through their reproduction and display on a massive scale. End of quote. This sad development, described by the famous social psychiatrist, even annuls the task of myths and art as mediators between the two mental and experiential realities. In our materialist and consumer culture, architecture has been totally instrumentalized, and buildings fail to sustain the spiritual and ideal dimension of our mental lives. In addition to providing shelter for our bodies and activities, architecture should also house our dreams and memories and provide ground for imagination and hope. It is evident that the ethical and humane task of architecture and all art is to defend the authenticity and autonomy of human experience, as well as the existence of the transcendental realm, the experience of the sacred. And I have entitled my last short chapter, Beauty and Goodness. The experience of the sacred in a natural phenomenon or a work of architecture is a reflection of this longing for sacredness and beauty. This experience materializes the human desire for a reality that surpasses the limits of our mortal existence. Beauty provides a promise of a mode of existence beyond temporality, mortality, and moral doubts. In the artistic experience, the categories of beauty, goodness, and truth are fused, as the experience of beauty evokes and maintains the possibility of a better world. Quote, "The purpose of evolution, believe it or not, is beauty, which survives it all and generates truth simply by being a fusion of the mental and the sensual," unquote. The poet Joseph Brodsky writes. And further, quote, "Aesthetics is the mother of ethics," he concludes. The experience of beauty calls for the capacities of empathy and compassion. The work becomes momentarily a part of one's personal experience and experience of existence and self. The ugliness of beauty expressed by the artistic image turns into experiences of one's own body and mind. A culture which loses its longing for an appreciation of beauty is surely on its way of losing its capacity of empathy and compassion, as well as its very force of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juhani. And now we have reserved some time for questions from audience, and we could elaborate some themes that Juhani discussed. And I guess there was 3 traditions that you presented to us. First, there was this romantic idea that art and religion are very close together and sometimes even combined together as a form of temple, for example. And if I quote Philippe Lacoue-Labat and Jean-Luc Nancy, they would speak about religion within the limits of art, referring to Kant's book of course. And then there was second tradition, which is the existential tradition, exemplified by Martin Heidegger's idea of Greek temple as an example of an artwork, and it's not coincidence that Heidegger chose a temple as his example in the origin of artwork lectures. And then there was third tradition, this when you were referring to Herbert Marcus, and it is the criticism of instrumentalization of architecture, because in Finland we have a strong tradition of functionalism, and of course Alvar Aalto exemplifies this tradition, that and there's a constant risk that architecture will be mere tool for rational design. So this is what I distinguished as three traditions, but please be free to ask or comment. Kimi.
You were talking about the beauty and goodness in the usage of light, for example.
Sorry, I was talking about...
the beauty and goodness in the use of light in architecture. I would like to ask your comment about Albert Speer's work for the Blue Temple in Nuremberg.
Well, there was a point in the mid-1980s when postmodernism was a strong movement, when Speer's architecture, for instance, the chancellery of Hitler was used as an example of architectural walk, promenade architectural. And I must say this distinction has to be made. The purpose of a structure has to be identified, and I cannot praise the chancellery as an architectural work. In fact, I have written about it in an essay about the black side of the dark side of architecture, because architectural means can be used for good or bad, positive or negative, liberating or imprisoning purposes. And there is a negative use of architecture as all artistic means. And I would say Albert Speer, regardless of his talent, he was clearly a gifted architect. He sold his soul to the evil.
Thank you for your lecture. I want to ask you to expand on or address the notion of the historicity of beauty, because it seems to me like the notion of beauty you present is kind of abstract in the sense that it becomes ahistorical, as if beauty was the same in ancient Greece, in classical time, and let me say post-Shoah Holocaust. And I'm not even sure that it's possible to talk about beauty after the disasters of the 20th century in the Kantian sense of beauty. And when I evoke the post-Holocaust, then of course the sublime becomes problematic as well, because of the disastrous effects of politics and aestheticized politics. So I'm just curious, in this metaphysical notion of beauty and sacredness, whether history is sort of set in parentheses, or whether you would say that there is a historicity that needs to be addressed in the construction of architectural artifacts.
Well, in my view, art is timeless, not as a product, but as experience. It is encounter with the work of art, as John Dewey strongly argues, which is the essence of the artistic experience. Art as experience, that is when it is actualized. So when I look at the Stone Age cave painting, which I often do, because they are so gorgeous, my looking actualizes that experience, and in that sense, it is timeless as long as there are people capable of actualizing that possibility. Otherwise, I do not support the idea of timelessness, because historicity of things is a very essential thing, and that also applies to human thought. I myself write quite a lot, and I always use a lot of quotes for the reason that I want to, or I like to, reveal the layering of thought, the historicity of thought. If I have written an idea, a sentence, and I read later someone who has formulated it before me, one day before or 1,000 years before me, I always erase my own formulation and I quote the earlier one to create the sense of how ideas layer. And I think that is something which is becoming lost in today's fragmented world, where, for instance, I fear that wisdom is disappearing from modern experience when everything becomes just information. Information is not wisdom. Wisdom is when things are integrated into a historical continuum and one's personal life experience.
Lovely lecture, lovely rich lecture and beautiful images. When I'm looking through these images, being a scholar of popular religion, there are spaces, they are something like what Eric just said. To me, they are Western spaces produced by the Western imagination, very much by not all of your images, of course, but because there are images from the history of Christianity, early history of Christianity, but a lot of them are like pre or modern Western spaces, and they are public spaces, but they are void of people. There are no people in spaces. In these kinds of images, of course, they could come from art books, that makes them spaces to be seen, to be looked at, and so like the relation to the space is a visual relation more than a practical relation. And then it makes me think about the practices that these places could include. Of course, there's the Parliament House, and there are a lot of sacred religious places, and so. But well, these are fuzzy thoughts only and reflections. But then I think that apart from maybe for me reflecting on something like Eric also said, timeless, imaginary. I think they also reflect a class-bound vision of sacredness and beauty. I wonder, people even today, they are from the perspective of a person, scholar like me, they are producing sacredness with bric-a-brac and with all much more banal looking, some people would say something much more banal, like commercial stuff, and people who are not, of course, architects or artists, but who bricolage with what they have at hand. And another comment only is about, and it connects with the first question, it is about the other side of, there are of course many ways of defining sacredness, but the other side of the sacred, which is, you mentioned once, I think, is the terrible, the horrible and the bad. And that is very important. Also, when we think about sacred places, a lot of sacred places are also places of power, places of subordinating people, etc. More like comments, so you can answer if you like. Thank you.
Well, I must say that Western bias, perhaps, of my images is not intentional at all. I have myself collection of Tibetan mandalas, Indian miniature paintings, Japanese woodcuts, etc., icons. So, for me, the existential, sacred, if one wishes to use that word, they are also exist without cultural boundaries. And as I said, the domestic life of the Dogon people was probably the most impressive religious experience I have had. I'm not religious in a devotional sense myself, but I fully understand or grasp the sacred dimension of existence, and I try to make the point that the sacred dimension can exist in a minute thing and in a very ordinary thing, and very often the sacredness, the attempt to create sacred experience turns into kitsch and banality, and usually that case is a result of relying too much on symbolization. Symbolization, in my view, in the language of art, has been far too much played, too much, it has been given too strong a role. Of course, it has its place, absolutely, but I'm not impressed by an icon painting because of its iconographic qualities, but by its painterly qualities. I don't know, I couldn't answer your comment.
If you find a good concept of sacred architecture or sacred place, let's take the Resurrection Chapel as an example. Can you copy and multiply that to 100 other cities? Is uniqueness needed for sacredness? Can sacredness be copyrighted?
I would say you cannot copy a sacred object or space. It turns into a kitsch through that very process. And the reason, in my view, is that we are utterly sensitive to the qualities of things. We read authenticity with surprising precision. I have been lately working on the idea of atmospheric experience. When we enter a space or even an entire city, we immediately understand it. Even before having grasped a single detail, we understand the atmosphere of a space or place. And I think that comes through our evolutionary history, that in order to survive, we and all our other animals had to develop surprising capacities of understanding the existential meaning of settings immediately. And we have lost that. And I think we are increasingly losing those capacities because our society tends to take to guide us too much. When everything is provided with a handrail, for instance, we kill ourselves because we don't develop our natural reactions. I think there's a lot of negative patronizing in today's society. And so coming back to your question, I do not think an artistic space or object can be duplicated. Of course, there is the case, the case of multiples, for instance. I would say I believed as a young man that the artistic world, in the artistic world there are truths and untruths. Now I do not think anymore so. To most questions in the artistic world or the mental world, you can answer yes and no, both yes and no, depending on your slight difference in the viewing angle. So your question would need a much longer answer than I can give here. So I would answer your question yes and no.
I think there is an interesting difference between the Holy Scripture, which is still sacred after printing 1 billion copies, and architecture, which is needed in a unique format.
Yes. Yes. It derives from the difference, contextual difference between the text and architecture. Architecture articulates this very place, here and now, whereas text has a placeless value and message.
Is there any comments or questions? If not, let's thank once again Juhani Pallasmaa